Sometimes you just encounter a completely random smattering of books. Like what happened this time in this video. I have pulpy vintage science fiction books combined with some fantasy novels, combined with historical fiction masquerading as science fiction, and so many more. I even have a very strange encounter about a book and a bug. Let's get into it. All right, guys, it's time for the encounter story. So, to begin with, the book in question is a book I'm so excited to share that I finally have finished, and that is The Dark Forest. This is the second book in the Three Body Problem series, and I have been meaning to read it literally all year, and I just have continually put it off because I knew I needed to dedicate a lot of time and energy into reading this book. So I don't know what happened to his editor, but dude, there's no chapters. Like, why? That's uncool. Like, don't do that. Anyway, so I finally got around to picking up this book and I got really into it. I'm like a third of the way through this book, and because there are no chapters, I'm reading it in bed and I hear this like weird fluttery noise. Don't think much about it because I do have two dogs and I'm in the middle of my book, okay? It's like really good. So I'm right in the middle of this book and they're having this big epic meeting and all of these big reveals sort of halfway through this book. And I hear the fluttery noise again and I just ignore it. And then I slowly kind of like have to readjust and turn over in bed. And right there is this huge flying cockroach on my pillow right next to me. I did the only sane thing and picked up the book and immediately threw it at the bug and ran away. Yes, 100% ran away. It was very irksome for at least two reasons. So the first reason is I couldn't sleep in my bed that night because I can't sleep in bed with a cockroach. That's not okay. And second is I did not have the courage to go back into the room to pick up my book. So I took forever to pick this book up again because I didn't know where the cockroach was and I didn't want to go into that room. So long story short, I actually got through another book, picked up the whole thing, read the whole book through, and then finally, I really wanted to get into this book, and I went in with a spatula and had to like flip over the book to make sure that there was no cockroach guts all over the front cover or in between the pages. And of course, I lost my page, so I had to go back and like reread a whole bunch, which was really annoying because did I mention that this book doesn't have chapters? Why? Anyway, sorry about that. I hate cockroaches, and I had to find it in my room and kill it to be able to sleep in my room again and to finally finish this book. Don't worry, I Cloroxed it. It's safe. That is the encounter that definitely is what I'm going to remember about this book, which is ironic because there were a lot of really big concepts and really interesting ideas in this book. I know it's a lot of fan favorites. However, gotta say, I actually enjoyed the first book better than I did the second book. I thought this book was a little bit more cohesive. He's definitely getting better as a writer and especially a character writer. But as far as plot elements goes, there's one big reveal at the end I was, I guess, underwhelmed by. My impressions were negatively affected by the cockroach situation. So I'm definitely going to pick up book 3 in this series called Death's End. I think I have it down there on the shelf over there. But I cannot wait to make sure that I don't have a cockroach situation for that book. Now let's move on to some other random encounter books. Well, hello, friends! It's been a long time. It has been maybe an entire age. I'm just gonna talk about some of the books that I haven't gotten a chance to talk about on my channel yet. That way, we can kind of do a little bit of catch up. All right, you guys, these are books that didn't make any of my top lists, but I still wanted to talk about them. The first is a book called The Ship Who Sang by Anne McCaffrey. This is a science fiction author that I have wanted to read from beyond just her Dragon Riders of Pern. I really wanted to see what other kinds of books she had to offer. I really thought this book was an okay one. Follows a main character called Helva, who was born crippled of some way, and so her body was put into a ship. So instead of having an AI run and guide a ship, it is actually a human mind. And so anybody who has an imperfect body is put into a ship. And she is then paired with a pilot, and this book is all about her quest to be paired with a pilot. It's kind of similar to a woman's search for a husband, but it's the ship's search for a pilot. There was a lot of things that go in between it. This was definitely a very feminist novel for when it was at the time, especially since Helva was a very strong, very capable woman. And this was a fun, pulpy read, but definitely not one that made my top list. I may or may not continue with this series if I have more time, but definitely one to consider to pick up. Another one is, both of these books are ones I picked up exclusively for the author. This one is called The Whole Man by James Brunner. This one is a very short book. It is about another cripple who has telepathic powers. And as he not only develops these telepathic powers, you get to see his very humble beginnings and how the telepathic powers change him fundamentally from the beginning to the end. And sometimes it's for the better and sometimes it's not. And it's really about him becoming a whole man and how he can overcome all of his jealousy and all of his, I'm gonna say, loneliness that being crippled has really placed on him. This is a lot of heavy themes for such a short book, but I have to say it took me a really long time to finish it because I really just did not like the main character. I didn't feel any terms of empathy for him because he didn't feel any empathy for me. It wasn't something that I related to in particular. This book was a Hugo nominee, and I usually like John Brunner's stuff, but in my opinion, this definitely wasn't his best work. Maybe I just wasn't in the mood for it at the time. I have been really busy lately with life, so I'm not really sure what it was about this book, but I found him to be a little bit too idealistic, a little bit too selfish. I found the summary of this story to be, again, too pretty of a bow, and that wasn't very believable. But that said, I'm glad I read it. The next one is a Robert Silverberg. It's called The World Inside. I think this cover is better than the covers I found online. I think somebody got mad at this book because there's like a rip down the middle of this book. I don't understand how that happened, but anyway, this book really surprised me. It's really about how humanity has survived in such a populated world. We now live in these huge towers where you're not given a whole lot of space and you're sort of relegated to your individual floor. And to keep people happy, each floor, it has to do with your class, and you get to get married at age 13. You're kind of forced into it, but you're allowed to sleep around with anybody else's wife or husband as you so desire. This book follows multiple points of view of multiple characters who are definitely intermingling with each other and have different goals and different beliefs. This book had a couple of characters who were able to get out of the monad and see what the world outside is like, where they were no longer really accepted. This novel was a very interesting run on how people can be placated. In many ways, it reminded me a lot of either Brave New World or 1984 because it had a lot of dystopian themes, but it was covered by the fact that everybody gets a little bit of drugs, everybody gets a little bit of gene manipulation, and of course everybody gets to have sex with everyone else. So, you know, must be a wonderful world, right? And throughout the novel, you get the idea that nobody is really happy in this society. I thought it was an interesting read. It had a lot of different things that I think would be fun to talk about, discussion elements. I do think that it is one that I'm thinking about, but it's definitely not his best work either. To some degree, I think it was also a little bit of his personal fantasies as well. The next vintage, pulpy, classic science fiction novel is A Case of Conscience by James Blish. This is a book that I had already read, that I picked up a copy at one of my local used bookstores. I hadn't ever actually seen this particular cover before, but I do plan on reading several more of James Blish's stories, including Dr. Mirabilis and Black Easter. But this book I had already read, so I went ahead and picked up a copy of it. So I just wanted to show everybody I now have a physical copy. Then let's get into some modern science fiction books that I have been reading. The first is How to Live Safely in a Science Fiction Universe. This book I definitely bought for the title. What a cool and clever idea. This book deals mainly with time travel and is really about a half Asian man named Charles who is just trying to come to terms with his relationship with his father. And despite the fact that there is time travel in this book and there's some really clever fun parts, it's really just about coming to terms with your parents and adulthood. And it's a very slice of life book. There's not tons and tons of action. It's a lot about your emotional health. So if this is a book that sounds like something that you would be interested in, definitely check it out. It is a novel that I need to think about a little bit more as I recently read it, but overall, my impression was positive, good vibes. The next two books are books that I have been meaning to read for my 2023 epic list to finish it off. I read Doomsday Book by Connie Willis. I finally got around to this one, you guys. I really enjoy Connie Willis's writing style. It's very engaging, and she definitely has her moments where she's trying to be funny. She has a lot of emotional connection. She's really good at writing characters that you empathize with. However, I did think that this book wasn't really qualifying as science fiction. It did have some science fiction elements like time travel, but this book mainly deals with a girl named Kivrin who wants to be a historian and trains up to go back into the past during the Middle Ages. And of course, they're planning what time to go is the best time for her and all of this kind of thing, where exactly she should land. And she gets there and there's some big mistake and she happens to arrive right as the Black Plague hits. And of course, there's some added mystery of something went wrong with the machine in today's day and age, and of course people are starting to get ill, and the big question is, did the Black Plague cross over or did it not? Outside of that, this was a spectacular piece of historical fiction. I really enjoyed this book, but again, I don't think I would call this science fiction. It's only that way just at the very lightest of tones. However, this also means that I get to finally pick up To Say Nothing of the Dog, which I have heard nothing but fantastic things about, and I think I have a copy of it. The next one from my 2023 list is a fantasy novel called The City Upstairs, is the next book on the list, and this book is one that I just keep encountering, and so I finally decided to put it on my list without knowing a whole lot about it. And I gotta say, this book is definitely for people who are a fan of Brandon Sanderson's Way of Kings. This book had a very similar vibe, where he uses fantasy and magical beings and gods and goddesses to really explore some of the human elements of government and how we reign ourselves, where magic in the city is not, how do I say this? This book actually stuck with me for a little while after reading it. We follow a main character who is a part of the government, and her job is to track down elements of magic and magical items that have been left behind by the dead gods. All of the gods are dead by the time this book starts. And of course, since the gods used to control the magic and now are no longer controlling it, magic runs free and does things that it's not supposed to, which is why the magical elements are being rounded up and collected and are not allowed to be out in public. This city was definitely once a city of the gods. It was once very magical, and now, because the gods are dead, it only half functions. And so it's a pretty dangerous place to be. And this book was an incredibly fun read. It's so unlike anything else I have ever read, and it definitely has vibes of very mature without having a lot of deep, dark, or sexual themes in it, in the way that Brandon Sanderson does as well with Way of Kings. So there aren't the same typical magical tropes that we see time after time. There's no conquered hero. There's a very dead world. I think this book would be something that you would like if you haven't already. And I definitely plan on picking up the second and the third book in the series, and maybe some of the other books that this author has written, because I really enjoyed it. Now, the next book on my list is probably one of the weirdest science fiction books I've ever read. It is called The Mount by Carol M. Schweiler. I think that's how you say her name. All the covers of this book are very unfortunate. However, the premise of this story is very interesting and very weird. It's following a main character who is a child, although it is not a young adult book. Let me make that very clear. And this child has grown up in a world that has already been conquered by aliens. And these aliens use humans and breed humans as their mounts, kind of like we use and breed horses for travel. This book follows our main character, Charlie, who is a child who has grown up in this world and wants nothing more than to be the prize mount to his owner, and kind of gets a wrench thrown into that plan when he encounters free humans. This book really has a lot to say about slavery, and it has a lot to say about the innocence of children and exactly how naive we are when we don't know the issues that are around us. I really found this book to be a lot more in-depth and nuanced than I initially expected. And yet it was all very well and very cleverly hidden within the context of the story, because Charlie himself doesn't realize all of the things that maybe the reader does because of how he grew up and because of his expectations. So I thought this book was very weird. It's definitely not for everyone, and it's definitely not going to make any of my top lists anytime soon. But this book really made me think a lot about several aspects of my life, and also the things that children see that we do not. I think that this book is definitely one where if you're in the mood for a little bit of a mix-up, definitely should consider picking this one up. The next book is a standalone space opera book called Providence by Max Berry. This one is a little bit of a thriller, and there's a mystery to the ending, so I'm not going to cover too much here. I definitely was attracted to the front cover of this with the red and the spaceman in the middle. Definitely not a cover I see very often. This book comes right after we have first contact with an alien race that is very warlike. And Earth decides to send multiple ships into the stars to try to find the alien race's homeworld before they attack us again. And all of the book kind of revolves around the crew of Providence number 5, who are trying to deal with the fact that they have an automated ship and what they're going to do with these alien species when they get there. And of course, things go awry. The villain of this novel isn't who you think it is, and it doesn't happen the way that I expected. So this was a fun, twisty novel that I wasn't expecting until sort of about the middle to the end of the book, and then I was sort of able to call it, but it ended up being a little bit more nuanced and in-depth and more about humanity than it was about aliens. This was a fun book and something that would be worthwhile to talk about in a book discussion, a roundtable conversation, because it brings up a lot about what our expectations are versus intentions. Do those things matter? What about AI and their place in our future? And what would really happen if we knew that there was a threat looming on the horizon? Definitely a book worth a conversation. And last but not least for this video is a book called In Ascension by Martin McInnes. I found this book, I think, because it came out this year and I'm always looking for new Hugo nominations. I also found this book because it was a Booker nominee. This book does a very clever thing. It combines our main character of Lee, who is a microbiologist and a person who studies the creatures in the deep sea. And so we follow her as we establish her character through her childhood into her studies of the Mariana Trench. And those studies of the Mariana Trench and studies of those creatures eventually lead us to outer space and an outer space mission in an attempt to save humanity. This book was a very, very slow burn. The author took their time really establishing the character, really establishing how she was raised, and continually brings up her past and her problems with her parents and her problems with how she was raised, her relationship with her sister, even up until the very end pages. And I feel like this author is trying to have a therapy session with the reader and did not include a lot of those deep and detailed scientific facts that I was really hoping for in a book about a microbiologist and all of the things that happened. I also thought that there was a pretty extreme tone shift towards the last several chapters of this book that made me a little bit unhappy and not excited about recommending this book. But the rest of the book was definitely slice of life. If you're a big fan of literary science fiction, this is definitely a book for you. However, I think I've discovered through this book that I'm always inevitably disappointed with the ending of literary science fiction books because I think the authors try too hard. Maybe I have that wrong and I'm just picking up the wrong literary science fiction books, but if you happen to know of one that like super lands the ending, please let me know in the comments section down below. Otherwise, you guys, thanks for letting me take a little break from BookTube, and I have a bunch of upcoming content for you guys, so I will see you in the next video.